The first gun wasn't really invented. Not in one moment, anyway. There was no genius sitting at a workbench, holding up a finished firearm and saying, "There, I've done it." Nothing like that happened. Instead, the gun appeared piece by piece over hundreds of years because people kept running into problems. How do you turn an explosion into a weapon? How do you stop that weapon from exploding in your own hands? How do you aim it while also holding a burning fuse? And once you finally build something reliable, how do you organize an entire army around it? Every version solved one problem and immediately created another. And the whole process started with a group of people who weren't trying to invent a weapon at all. They were trying to cheat death. Sometime around the 9th century in China, Taoist alchemists were experimenting with different minerals and chemicals. Their goal was an elixir of immortality. Basically, a recipe that would let a person live forever. Which, looking back, makes what happened next feel almost cruel. They combined saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Then they heated it. Instead of producing eternal life, the mixture burned violently. In the right conditions, it exploded. Early accounts mentioned fires, damaged buildings, and burned faces or beards. So whoever discovered this mixture probably didn't celebrate. They probably ran. The Chinese called it huo yao, meaning fire medicine. Fire medicine. That name still carries the original mistake inside it. This wasn't supposed to become the chemical foundation of cannons, muskets, rifles, rockets, and centuries of warfare. It was supposed to be medicine. So how did failed immortality powder become a gun? Well, the first problem was surprisingly basic. An explosion by itself isn't necessarily useful. It's loud. It's hot. It might terrify people. But if the force shoots in every direction, most of that energy is wasted. To create a firearm, you have to trap that expanding gas and force it to travel in one direction. That idea sounds obvious now. It wasn't obvious then. Gunpowder works because saltpeter acts as an oxidizer. It allows the charcoal and sulfur to burn extremely quickly, producing a rapidly expanding cloud of hot gas. A common mixture eventually settled around 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. But the exact chemistry wasn't the big breakthrough. The breakthrough was realizing that the gas could push something. Before that happened, gunpowder was often used for things like fireworks, signals, religious displays, and celebrations. Imagine seeing it for the first time. You've lived your entire life in a world lit by candles, lamps, and ordinary fire. Then suddenly the night sky cracks open with light and thunder. That alone would have seemed supernatural. Military commanders naturally saw something else. They saw fear. During the Song dynasty, Chinese weapon makers began attaching bamboo tubes filled with gunpowder to the ends of spears. This weapon became known as the fire lance. And it wasn't quite a gun yet. Think of it as a spear that could briefly breathe fire. A soldier would ignite the powder, point the tube toward an enemy, and release a blast of flame, smoke, sparks, and burning material at close range. Was it accurate? No. Did it need to be? Also no. If you're climbing a siege ladder and someone above you suddenly fires a cloud of flame into your face, you're not stopping to evaluate the weapon's accuracy. You're falling off the ladder. Fire lances were used by Chinese defenders during the siege of Dian in 1132. Against troops trying to scale walls, the weapon could burn, blind, disorient, and panic attackers. That psychological effect mattered. For most soldiers at the time, combat meant spears, blades, arrows, and blunt force. Those were frightening, sure, but understandable. A man projecting fire from a tube? That felt different. Still, the fire lance had a limitation. It mostly burned whatever was directly in front of it. So weapon makers started adding small objects to the tube. Pellets, stones, pieces of pottery, bits of metal. Now the expanding gas wasn't just creating flame, it was throwing projectiles. And that change, small as it may sound, is where the basic idea of the gun really begins. Gunpowder burns. Gas expands. The gas pushes an object through a tube. That is the central principle behind nearly every firearm that followed. But now there was a new problem. Bamboo wasn't strong enough. Add more gunpowder and you get more force. More force means the projectile travels farther and hits harder. Great, except the tube might split open beside your face. Not great. Early gun makers needed a container strong enough to hold the explosion for a fraction of a second without bursting. The answer was metal. Chinese craftsmen began replacing bamboo with cast bronze and iron tubes. These barrels could survive much higher internal pressure and fire heavier projectiles. That gave birth to the hand cannon. Early hand cannons were incredibly simple. They were metal tubes, usually mounted on wooden handles or poles. Powder and a projectile went into the front. The shooter ignited the charge through a small hole near the back. There wasn't a proper trigger. There wasn't a comfortable stock. There wasn't much of a sighting system. You pointed the dangerous metal tube toward the enemy, touched fire to it, and hoped the explosion traveled forward. Mostly forward, anyway. By the 13th century, metal-barreled gunpowder weapons were being used across China. Engineers also built larger versions, including bombs and cannons designed for siege warfare. During the Mongol assault on Kaifeng in 1232, gunpowder weapons played a visible role in the city's defense. And the Mongols paid attention. This is where the story gets much bigger. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory. Their campaigns connected regions that had previously exchanged knowledge much more slowly. When they encountered useful technology, they absorbed it. Engineers, metal workers, weapon makers, and siege specialists moved with Mongol armies across enormous distances. So gunpowder knowledge began moving west. Not through one clean route. History almost never works that neatly. It spread through war, trade, captured craftsmen, diplomatic contact, copied designs, and people seeing a weapon and thinking, we need one of those. At the same time, gunpowder technology split into different branches. One branch led toward guns and cannons. Another led toward rockets and fire arrows. Chinese engineers developed projectiles that carried or used gunpowder for propulsion. Related designs later appeared in Korea, India, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe. So the same accidental chemical discovery produced two separate ideas. One pushed a projectile out of a barrel, the other pushed the projectile itself through the air. Guns on one side, rockets on the other. Both came from the same failed attempt to live forever. By the late medieval period, knowledge of gunpowder weapons had reached the Islamic world and Europe presented the technology with a new set of targets: castles, armored knights, dense political rivalries, constant warfare between kingdoms, cities, nobles, and empires. Early European guns were still crude. A small hand cannon might be little more than a metal barrel attached to a pole. Reloading was slow. Aiming was awkward. Ignition was unreliable. Sometimes the weapon fired late. Sometimes it didn't fire at all. Sometimes the shooter probably wished it hadn't fired. But the larger cannons were already changing warfare. For centuries, a tall stone wall had been one of the strongest military defenses available. An invading army could surround a castle. It could fire arrows, throw stones, dig tunnels, build siege towers, or wait for the defenders to starve. But thick stone walls might survive for months. Cannons changed the calculation. A cannonball could strike the same section repeatedly, cracking stone, shaking foundations, and eventually opening a breach. Suddenly, walls designed to stop arrows and climbing soldiers had to survive repeated impacts from heavy projectiles moving at enormous speed. Many couldn't. Castle design began changing in response. Tall, thin walls became liabilities. They were easier for cannons to hit and more likely to collapse. Fortifications became lower, wider, thicker, and more heavily reinforced. Angled bastions helped defenders cover approaches with overlapping fire. The dramatic towers of the medieval castles slowly gave way to squat, geometric forts built to absorb cannon attacks. The gun didn't just change weapons, it changed architecture. Then there was the knight. A heavily armored mounted warrior had once been one of the most expensive and powerful weapons on a European battlefield. Training could begin in childhood. Horses cost money. Armor cost money. Weapons, servants, land, and social position all mattered. Then along came a metal ball fired by a soldier who didn't need a noble title or decades of combat training. Early firearms didn't instantly make armor useless. That shift took time. But armor makers now had a problem. A breastplate might stop a blade or deflect an arrow. A close-range gunshot delivered a completely different kind of force. As firearms became stronger, armor had to become thicker. Thicker armor became heavier and more expensive. Eventually, the balance stopped making sense. Still, hand cannons had a serious weakness. Try aiming a heavy metal tube while holding it steady. Now use your other hand to bring a burning cord toward a tiny ignition hole. Now do that while people are screaming, horses are moving, smoke is everywhere, and someone is trying to kill you. That was the problem. The shooter needed both hands to control the weapon, but the weapon also required a hand to ignite it. The matchlock solved that. Instead of making the shooter manually touch a burning cord to the powder, gunmakers attached the cord to a moving arm. This curved arm was sometimes called a serpentine. Pull the trigger and the mechanism lowered the burning match into a small pan of priming powder. That flash then ignited the main gunpowder charge inside the barrel. For the first time, one person could hold the gun with both hands, aim it, and fire it through a mechanical trigger. That doesn't sound revolutionary now because every gun has a trigger. At the time, it changed everything. The gun was no longer just a small cannon that happened to be portable. It was becoming a personal weapon. Matchlock firearms spread across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, Central Asia, India, China, and Japan. Different cultures didn't simply copy the technology without changing it. They adjusted it to fit local needs, materials, tactics, and manufacturing skills. The Ottoman janissaries became known for their use of gunpowder weapons as firearms grew more common in the empire. Portuguese traders introduced matchlock guns to Japan in the 16th century. Japanese gunsmiths quickly copied and refined them. The weapons became known as Tanegashima, named after the island associated with their arrival. Within a surprisingly short period, Japanese forces were producing and using large numbers of matchlocks. And there's a strange loop here. Gunpowder began in China. The technology moved west, changed, improved, and spread. Then China encountered later versions of that same technology returning from abroad. History does this a lot. An invention leaves home, gets modified somewhere else, then comes back looking slightly unfamiliar. Matchlocks were much easier to aim than hand cannons, but they still weren't easy weapons. Some muskets became so long and heavy that soldiers used forked rests to support the barrel. Reloading took time. A soldier had to measure powder, pour it into the barrel, insert the projectile, add wadding, ram everything down, prepare the priming pan, manage the burning match, aim, and fire. And if cavalry reached him during that process, well, he had a very expensive club. That's why matchlock soldiers often fought beside pikemen. The pikemen carried long spears and protected the musketeers from cavalry and close-range attacks. The musketeers provided firepower. The pikemen provided a wall of sharp points. Together, this became the system known as pike and shot. It wasn't just about owning guns. The real advantage came from organizing soldiers so they could keep firing despite the slow reload time. One row fired, then moved back. Another row stepped forward. Commands, timing, spacing, and discipline mattered enormously. A firearm in the hands of one frightened person was dangerous. Hundreds of firearms operating in organized rotation could break an army. But the matchlock had an obvious flaw. It needed a burning match. All the time. Rain could ruin it. Wind could cause problems. The glow could reveal a soldier's position at night. The smell could betray an ambush. And walking around near loose gunpowder while carrying a burning cord was, let's say, not ideal. So gunmakers tried to remove the flame. One solution was the wheel lock. The mechanism used a spring-powered metal wheel rubbing against pyrite to create sparks. Think of it almost like the wheel on a modern lighter, except more complicated and much more expensive. The shooter could carry the weapon ready to fire without keeping a slow-burning cord lit. That made wheel locks useful for cavalry. A rider didn't want to control a horse, handle a weapon, and babysit a piece of burning rope at the same time. But wheel locks contained small, carefully made parts. They required skilled labor and cost far more than matchlocks. Wealthy officers and cavalrymen could afford them. Entire armies usually couldn't. So the cheaper matchlock remained in service. Then came the flintlock. A piece of flint sat in a spring-loaded hammer. Pulling the trigger snapped the flint against a steel surface called the frizzen. That impact created sparks. The frizzen also moved out of the way, exposing the priming powder beneath it. Spark hits powder. Powder flashes. The main charge ignites. The gun fires. No burning cord, no complex spinning wheel. The flintlock was simpler than the wheel lock, more convenient than the matchlock, and reliable enough to become the main infantry firearm mechanism across much of Europe. Versions of it remained dominant for roughly 2 centuries. Flintlock muskets armed soldiers through colonial wars, revolutions, imperial campaigns, and the Napoleonic era. But even with a better gun, infantry still had the old protection problem. What happens after you fire? The enemy might be close. You might not have time to reload. Earlier soldiers sometimes inserted a blade directly into the muzzle of a musket, creating what was called a plug bayonet. Useful for stabbing, terrible for shooting, because the blade was literally blocking the barrel. The socket bayonet fixed that. Instead of plugging into the muzzle, it attached around the outside of the barrel. Now the soldier could fire with the bayonet already fitted. That one change helped eliminate the need for separate pikemen. Every musket soldier could shoot at range and fight like a spearman up close. An army no longer needed one group carrying guns and another group carrying long pikes. The same infantryman could do both jobs. And now the firearm wasn't simply one weapon among many. It had started absorbing the roles of other weapons. It replaced parts of the siege engine. It challenged the bow. It weakened armored cavalry. It removed the need for the pike. But one more ignition problem remained. Flintlocks depended on sparks landing in exposed priming powder. Rain could still interfere. Powder could spill. Flints wore down. Misfires were common enough that soldiers had to expect them. The percussion cap changed that in the early 19th century. A small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive chemical compound sat over the gun's ignition point. When the hammer struck the cap, the compound detonated and sent flame into the main powder charge. It was faster, more compact, and more dependable than the flintlock system. No open priming pan, no shower of sparks, no carefully adjusted piece of flint. Once percussion ignition became practical, matchlocks, wheel locks, and flintlocks rapidly became outdated. And from there, development accelerated. Improved metallurgy allowed barrels to handle greater pressure. Industrial manufacturing made parts more consistent. Breech loading systems reduced reload time. Cartridges combined powder, projectile, and ignition components. Repeating weapons allowed multiple shots before reloading. Rifle barrels improved accuracy by spinning the projectile. Eventually, the gun became something those early alchemists could never have imagined. But here's the part I find most interesting. The invention of the gun wasn't one invention. It was a chain of answers. Gunpowder created expanding gas. The fire lance directed flame. Added fragments turned flame into projectile fire. Metal barrels contained greater pressure. The hand cannon made the system portable. The matchlock gave the shooter a trigger. The wheel lock removed the burning cord. The flintlock made ignition cheaper and more practical. The socket bayonet combined shooting and close combat. The percussion cap made firing more reliable. Each step looks small when you isolate it. Put them together, though, and they reshape the world. They bring down castle walls. They reduce the power of armored nobles. They transform armies from loose groups of individual warriors into coordinated formations built around timing and firepower. They travel from Chinese workshops to Mongol armies, Islamic states, European kingdoms, Japanese gunsmiths, and back again. No single civilization created the finished gun. Different people solved different problems at different times. Some were alchemists, some were soldiers, some were bronze casters, blacksmiths, mechanics, merchants, conquerors, and craftsmen. Most of them probably had no idea where the process would lead. And maybe that's the strangest part of the whole story. The people searching for immortality didn't find it, but the thing they discovered outlived them. It crossed continents, it survived dynasties, it destroyed old forms of power and created new ones. And centuries later, nearly every firearm still depends on the same basic event those alchemists accidentally created: powder burns. Gas expands, something moves.